My name is June Carter. I'm 35 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've existed behind redacted reports and locked doors. No medals, no rank on the collar, no name on the program. That's why my father didn't recognize me at first. The hall at Fort Thorne was filled with heavy uniforms and heavier silences. Retired officers decorated advisors, defense contractors with steel in their jaws, and among them sat Colonel Warren Carter, my father, front row pressed blues, polished brass, still carrying the look of a man who thought the world saluted him on instinct. He thought the ceremony was for someone else. I was seated 3 rows behind him, no ribbons, no insignia, just plain fabric and a name tag that said Observer. My name wasn't listed anywhere, not even under aliases. That was the point. The introductions began vague and efficient. Then General Halbrook stepped forward. He didn't read from a script. He didn't even glance at the binder. He simply looked out across the room and said 6 words. "We need shadow linguist in the room." The shift was instant. Heads turned, chairs stiffened. Some looked toward the entrance, expecting someone to walk in from the back. But I stood. One movement, quiet, controlled. My father's head turned with the others. His brow furrowed. Then his gaze locked on mine. And for the first time in my life, the man who once told me I was wasting my life learning useless languages stood, not in applause, not in affection, but because everyone else in that room already had. And in that moment, he finally understood. I wasn't the soldier he raised. I had become something far more dangerous. I was the one they called when understanding could save lives. And now I was no longer a secret. When I was 10, I stopped speaking at dinner. Not because I had nothing to say, but because nothing I said ever mattered to the man at the head of the table. My father, Colonel Warren Carter, was a soldier before he ever put on the uniform. Orders lived in his spine. Silence hung from his shoulders like epaulets. He didn't yell, he didn't hit, but disappointment wrapped itself around his voice like barbed wire. If I brought home a report card, he'd scan for math and physical education. If I mentioned something I read in a book, he'd ask, "Is it in the field manual?" When I said no, he'd shake his head, mutter, "Then it's not worth your time." So I learned to stop offering. I built a library under my bed instead, paperbacks from thrift stores, old dictionaries, language tapes I found at garage sales. My first shortwave radio came from a broken box behind the post office. It buzzed more than it spoke, but on cold nights I could catch fragments. A weather report in German, a protest broadcast in Dari, a lullaby in Urdu so soft I could barely hear the vowels. It was the first time I realized the world was bigger than our house, and more importantly, it didn't sound like him. I learned languages the way other kids learn dodgeball, quietly, obsessively. Not for school, not for grades, but for freedom. Each phrase I memorized felt like a door he couldn't close. When I was 12, I spoke my first full sentence in French at breakfast. My father looked up from his coffee, unimpressed. "That won't get you out of push-ups," he said. Then he added flatly, "It's useless." That was his favorite word for the things I loved. Books, poetry, syntax trees. He didn't say they were wrong. He said they didn't win wars. And if something didn't win wars, it didn't matter. So I learned Russian in the basement, Mandarin in the attic, with headphones wrapped in duct tape, Farsi from a woman at the laundromat, who noticed I was reading the detergent bottles in 3 different alphabets. She once taught me how to say strength without using the word. At home, my father never asked, never noticed. I think he assumed I'd grow out of it, that I'd join ROTC study engineering, learn to shoot straight, and put away the soft stuff. But languages didn't make me soft. They made me sharp. Each dialect was a blade. And I was learning how to carry 9 of them at once, silently, precisely, and right under his roof. Because I knew even then, one day silence wouldn't be my prison. It would be my weapon. And he'd never see it coming. I got my acceptance letter on a Tuesday. It came in a plain envelope with the seal of the National Defense Language Scholarship Program, embossed at the top, one of those federal grants that came with strings and service commitments. Full tuition, 4 years with a contract to serve in linguistic operations post-graduation. I stared at the letter for an hour without opening it. Then I placed it on the kitchen counter, exactly where my father dropped his keys every night. When he walked in, still in uniform, boots muddy and posture flawless, his eyes fell on the envelope. He picked it up, skimmed the first line, then set it down beside the grocery list without a word. No nod, no smile, just a grunt. "Guess you'll be speaking 10. By the time you're done," he muttered, reaching for a glass of orange juice. And that was it. That was all I got. No congratulations. No, "I'm proud of you." Not even a question about what I'd be doing. Just indifference dressed like discipline. He didn't ask what it meant to be accepted into the most selective defense language program in the country. He didn't ask where I'd be going, and he definitely didn't ask why I'd chosen to commit myself to service in a field he didn't respect. Because in his world, soldiers bled. They broke things. They fired first and sorted it out later. He didn't understand the kind of warfare that didn't start with a rifle. But I wasn't asking him to understand. I packed my bags 3 months later and left for a university 9 states away. Not far enough to feel like exile, but far enough that he couldn't show up unannounced. ROTC wasn't easy, but I didn't expect it to be. I marched, I trained, I learned to shoot, I learned to disappear, I learned how to make my voice sound smaller than it was, to blend, to obey, to bide time. And between all of that, I studied phonetics, dialect patterns, code switching across conflict zones. I translated training manuals for refugee missions. I rewrote outdated communication guides for soldiers deployed in regions they couldn't pronounce. I also started building something no one could quite name, an algorithm that could trace political agitation through changes in idiomatic speech. My advisor called it abstract. I called it a weapon no one else saw coming. No one back home ever asked how I was doing, not once. Sometimes walking back to my dorm after midnight study sessions, I'd catch myself thinking maybe he's proud of me now. Then I'd remember the way he folded that acceptance letter in half, like it was a receipt. And I'd remind myself I wasn't doing this for him. I was doing it for the girl who used to speak to shortwave radios at night. The one who didn't need permission, just one chance to be heard. The mission in Badakhshan wasn't supposed to be complicated. Low profile, minimal exposure. I was embedded with a small field team assigned to coordinate medical logistics near the Afghan-Tajik border, just a translator on paper, a cultural liaison in practice. But beneath the humanitarian cover, there was a secondary layer, an asset. A name buried deep in a network of tribal negotiators and regional fixers. Someone whose intel could fracture the financial spine of a weapons smuggling chain SIO had been tracking for years. We were close. Too close. Then a voice came through the comms, Arabic, but not local dialect. Flat vowels, clipped consonants, the kind you only hear from someone who studied the language, not lived it. And then it said my name. Not my code name, not the linguist, not Echo Team's translator. It said June Carter. That name spoken across unsecured comms cut through the silence like shrapnel. Staff Sergeant Keller standing beside me froze. "How the hell would anyone out here know your real name?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. 30 minutes later, a routine checkpoint turned into a coordinated ambush. 3 of our local contacts vanished. The fallback safe house had already been burned. We moved. Too late. Someone knew every route we'd mapped. A sniper round caught Keller in the shoulder. He bled all over my scarf while I kept pressure on the wound with shaking hands and clenched teeth. He survived. But when we were finally airlifted out under blackout protocol, I already knew the real wound wasn't physical. It was digital. The breach had a shape, a signature, and it started with someone inserting my real name into the field data stream. Back in Germany, I was pulled from operations. Temporary reassignment, pending administrative review, they said. Code for, "We don't trust you right now." I was placed in a monitoring station outside Stuttgart. No missions, no briefings, just transcripts of comms I wasn't allowed to hear live. Translation without context. Analysis without impact. It felt like exile. And yet I didn't argue. I didn't protest. Because a part of me had already started calculating. The signal was too clean, too surgical. Whoever dropped my name didn't do it by accident. This wasn't sabotage from the outside. It came from inside the house. Someone had accessed a legacy encryption framework, one I hadn't heard mentioned in over a decade. Project Orion Lattice, clearance level C4. Oversight signatory Colonel Warren Carter, my father. He had touched the same system that opened the back door to that breach. I stared at the metadata until the numbers stopped looking like code and started looking like intent. It didn't prove he did it, but it proved he was in the room when the gate was left unlocked. And that was enough to know this wasn't just a security failure. It was betrayal with a familiar signature. I didn't sleep that night, not out of fear, out of clarity, the kind that comes when the puzzle stops shifting and the shape reveals itself. I sat in a dark room in Stuttgart, nothing but the glow of my screen and the weight of what I couldn't yet prove. I didn't report it. Not then. Reporting meant alerting the wrong people too early. I'd been in this system long enough to know how it handled whispers. It buried them with silence and paperwork. So I didn't make noise. I made a map. I traced document trails, cross-referenced timestamps, rebuilt access logs no longer stored in active memory. I slipped through ghost channels I had helped design 5 years earlier, back when I still believed security could be trusted to those who had never been compromised. And what I found wasn't explosive. It was surgical. One retired contractor, one temporary override key, one outdated protocol reactivated 3 months before the mission in Badakhshan. The same encryption lattice my father had authorized during his final consultancy year with a private vendor tied to defense back-end systems. It could have been a mistake. It could have been negligence. But the system didn't misfire randomly. It was used with purpose, and someone had let it happen. The logs showed his digital signature, his clearance level, the time of day he approved the patch, the location of the access terminal, a private consultancy suite in Arlington. The IP was registered to a firm that listed him, Warren Carter, as senior technical advisor. My father hadn't just walked away from the system. He had stayed in its shadow. And that shadow had touched the breach that nearly killed Keller and burned my name in enemy channels. Still, it wasn't enough. Not for a formal charge, not yet. So I built a report, 8 pages. No personal narrative, no accusations, just facts layered, timestamped, signed under a ghost alias I hadn't used since an anti-propaganda sweep in Moldova. Alex Marsh, External Systems Observer. I routed the file through a low-level intel node buried beneath compliance oversight at SIO. Not a whistleblower channel, not a leak. A scalpel. 3 days later, a reply came through, pattern confirmed. Quiet escalation approved. Source acknowledged. In SIO terms, it meant we see you, we believe you, we move in silence. I never got another message. I didn't need one. But what followed told me they were watching closely. 2 senior consultants were placed on indefinite leave. One of the vendor's subcontractors was flagged for audit. And quietly, without public fanfare, a ceremony was announced, a recognition event at Fort Thorne for long-term technical advisors contributing to secure operational intelligence. My father's name was on the list. He thought it was a medal. But it wasn't. It was the moment SIO chose to break its silence with a pageantry only insiders would understand. And I knew I would be standing in that room, not as a name, not even as a warning, but as the proof that silence has a shape. And mine was finally stepping into the light. Fort Thorne's main hall smelled like polished wood and compressed expectation. Rows of uniforms, some freshly starched, some faded by years, lined the room in precise symmetry. Bronze plaques glinted under sterile lighting. Behind the podium, a banner read, "Recognition of Technical Excellence in Strategic Operations." No one smiled. I was escorted through the side entrance. No rank, no ribbons, no listed name, just a silent checkmark next to confirmed. My seat was row 3, chair 5. From there, I could see the full width of the room, and just beyond it, him. My father sat in the front row VIP section, navy blazer, collar straight, posture so perfect it looked carved. He nodded politely when someone called his name. He didn't know yet, but soon he would. The ceremony began exactly at 0900. A junior officer stepped to the podium and read from a leather-bound script. The citations were vague by design. Code names, initials, nothing traceable to the public eye. I recognized some of the descriptors missions I'd ghosted through languages I'd decoded in the dark crises averted with no credit. And then came the pause. The binder closed. The junior officer stepped back. A new figure walked forward. Tall, weathered voice like gravel polished by war. General Halbrook. He didn't carry a folder. He didn't read a name. He simply looked out across the sea of medals and said, "This next recognition is not ceremonial. It is corrective." You could feel the air tighten. He continued, "There is someone in this room whose work has reshaped operational security across 5 continents. Someone whose contributions were invisible by design. Until now." Chairs shifted, throats cleared, then the 6 words. "We need shadow linguist in the room." He didn't say my name, but the silence said everything else. I stood. Not slowly, not dramatically, just decisively. From the front row, my father's head turned once, then again searching for the source. His jaw tightened. His brow lifted just a fraction. And then he saw me. He didn't blink, didn't speak, but he stood. Because every officer in that room already had. I stepped into the aisle. No one clapped. No one whispered. I passed decorated veterans analysts with classified histories, commanders who'd never known my name, but who recognized my work. Eyes followed, but none met mine. At the front, General Halbrook stepped aside, giving me space with a single solemn nod. I didn't take the mic. I didn't need to. I turned and faced the room. And then the room stood straighter. A ripple of silent acknowledgement moved through pressed jackets and weathered hands. One by one, back-straightened gazes lowered in respect. My father stood frozen, not in anger, not shame, but recalibration. He had spent a lifetime defining strength by volume, by steel, by command. And now his daughter, once dismissed as soft, irrelevant, useless with a map, had walked into the one room he thought he owned and silenced it without saying a word. I held his stare for a moment, not to win, not to punish, but to be seen. And when I finally turned to sit, the silence didn't break. Because real recognition doesn't need applause. It just needs to arrive. He didn't come speak to me after the ceremony. He didn't stay for the reception or the post-event briefing. While others clinked glasses and shook hands behind closed doors, my father stood near the exit under the insignia of the Strategic Intelligence Division, motionless back straight, clutching his phone like it might tether him to a version of reality he could still control. I didn't approach him. There's a silence more powerful than any accusation, and I'd earned the right to use it. Instead, I watched as he stepped outside alone, disappearing into the sharp Virginia wind. I figured that was the end of it. Our story folded back into the same sterile distance it had always lived in. 3 days passed, no calls, no messages, no second glances from the officers who now understood exactly who I was. On the 4th morning just past 0600, I saw the notification. No subject line, no sender, just one encrypted attachment. I opened it. A white screen, centered text, 1 sentence. "If I admit negligence, will you keep it sealed?" No greeting, no explanation, no apology, just an equation. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, he was asking for control. I stared at those words for a long time, not because I didn't understand them, but because I did, perfectly. This wasn't about guilt, it was about legacy, about whether the daughter he had trained to be silent would now choose to speak. I didn't answer right away. I walked to the kitchen, poured a cup of stale coffee, sat on the floor next to the radiator, like I had in college when I was broke and nameless, and still believed maybe, just maybe, he'd call. But now I didn't need a call. I needed a decision. I opened my laptop, typed 1 word. No. No conditions, no threats, no leverage. Not because I wanted to destroy him, but because I wasn't afraid of him anymore. He didn't reply. Not that day. Not the next. But 3 nights later, I got an alert. An encrypted archive one I'd forgotten was still synced to my childhood home's network had been accessed. Specifically, a metadata file from the Orion Lattice breach, the one with his signature buried deep in the code trail. He hadn't responded to my message. He had gone searching for his own truth, maybe to understand what he'd signed, maybe to confirm it really happened, Or maybe for the first time to face the cost of looking away. He didn't write back after that, but I didn't need him to. Because acknowledgement doesn't always come through words. Sometimes it arrives as silence, the kind that finally knows its own weight. The letter came on a Thursday. Top left Strategic Intelligence Operations. Top right, June Carter. Just a single paragraph. Voluntary reassignment approved. From Field Operations to Director, Cultural and Linguistic Intelligence Training. I had signed it myself. No scandal, no exile. Just a quiet shift from ghost missions to something with my name on the door. The office was small, windowless, tucked behind the training complex. But outside, mounted on steel, was a plaque with 4 words. The Shadow Linguist Room, no ceremony. No audience, just acknowledgement. I stood in the doorway, hand on the frame, not to reminisce, but to breathe. Inside were 12 officers, majors, captains, analysts, some weathered, others sharp-edged. They weren't there to learn grammar. They came to understand what happens when silence misleads or saves. I picked up the marker and wrote on the board Strategic Communication in High-Stakes Terrain beneath it. Understanding as a mission asset. Then I turned. We're not starting with phrases, I told them. We're starting with what gets lost when people rush to speak. They didn't answer, but they listened. In week 3, one stayed behind. A commander older than most. "Ma'am," he asked, "were you really shadow linguist?" I let the silence stretch, then said, "That name only matters if it meant someone came home because of it." He nodded, then left. That night, I unlocked the drawer where I kept 3 things: the cipher that exposed me, my unsigned confession, and Keller's scarf still stained from that day outside Badakhshan. I added a photo. I was 10, sitting cross-legged on the floor, mid-sentence, eyes locked on a page. No one else in the shot. Taped to the back was a typed note. "You once said intelligence should mean more than knowledge. Maybe now it does." No signature, but I knew. He never said the words out loud. He didn't need to. Some truths arrive in silence, and this one had been echoing for years.